So I think the best place to jump off from when we talk about exposure is just getting very clear about what skill we are improving, or what area are we looking to shift or to alter in our normal day-to-day operations to see things a different way, to become better at exposure. And the very first thing that has to happen, which might sound counterintuitive, is that we have to unlearn how we normally see the world. You have gone through life developing a skill with which to interpret the visual information that is being beamed into your eyeballs. You and I see the world very differently. If you don't know this skill, we see the world vastly differently. Almost like you can think of it like Neo and the Matrix. How you see the world one way and I see the world another way. What we're doing when we talk about mastering exposure is we're trying to unlearn the way that you see the world and begin to see the world the way the camera will see the world. So we need to think as the camera thinks. We need to see the same values in light, in shape, that the camera will see. And as you become better at understanding how the camera sees the world, so too will your skills in exposure begin to line up with all of the other techniques that you use to get everything that you possibly can out of a given scene or a given setup. This is how you become better at exposure. So we are looking to unlearn how you see the world and then try and show you, well, okay, well, how does the camera, and in our case these days, it's most often a digital film sensor. How does that sensor react to the information that we are feeding inside of it? Because all we're doing with all of the tools that we have for exposure, for limiting exposure or for containing exposure on set, which we're going to talk about in the next few sections, all of these tools, all they are doing is limiting the field of view, the variables that we have to concern ourselves with. How much light is hitting the sensor at any given time? Where is it hitting the sensor? And what is the repercussions of those decisions? Of that light hitting the sensor for that amount of time, what does that translate to? So we have to understand, we have to speak the language of camera, and specifically the camera that we're using for whatever job it might be. And that will change. Each camera will have a different language, but in broad strokes, it is very much similar across the range, which is what I said previously in the section before, is that you really only have to learn these skills once because it's so general. We take the skills and we take the tools that we can set our window for exposure, and then we manipulate and work inside of that sandbox. And once you do those things, you're going to start to see some very repeatable patterns that will then help you inform future work. And the more that you can see those patterns ahead of time, the more you can decide what you like and what you don't like. It'll start to inform your taste. And as it does that, you become more active in deciding what the final image is going to look like, which means you can marry it up with how it makes you feel, or the feeling that you want to impose on the audience around you. So what we're doing is we're learning to see how the camera sees. And the quicker we can do that, and the more accurate we can be with deciphering, this is what the scene looks like in the real world, how is that going to translate to the camera? So that is the mission that we were on with this course, is learning to develop a sixth sense for the light that's in the real world versus the light that is going to hit the sensor. Because that is ultimately why we do everything we do in the physical world on all film sets, is to determine the light that is coming into that sensor. Because at the end of the day, that's all anyone is going to respond to. Okay, so before we go any further, it's important to get a base understanding of a definition for exposure that you've probably heard before. It's not going to have anything to do with the information that we're going to delve into further in the course, but just so you know what exposure actually is in a traditional definition, I would say it's the overall brightness or darkness of an image that is determined by how much light is hitting the piece of film, or again in our day, hitting the digital sensor. The more amount of light that hits the sensor, the brighter the image is going to be relative to the less light that is going to hit the sensor. So we are deciding how much light to expose the sensor to. There are a bunch of different tools that we can use on a film set to either limit or exaggerate the amount of light that is hitting a sensor. That's the entire job. Again, because there is nothing outside of that. It's easy to complicate things. It's easy to overthink what we're doing on a film set. But really, it's just about determining how much light and where on the sensor that light actually hits that is going to affect the final image. Because remember, we're working in a two-dimensional medium. but we are trying to make it appear as though it's three-dimensional. So we're constantly looking to add depth by alternating light and dark and creating contrast to then create shape. And exposure is just about determining, well, how long are we going to expose the sensor for a given series of images to create the world that we would like to live in for this period of time. So really it's a way to gauge and measure how much light is hitting the sensor. Now, that doesn't do a whole lot for us in terms of coming up with our own systems for developing the kinds of exposure that we want, but as a base definition, it's not bad for understanding, at least at the very bottom of things, what is actually happening. What are we trying to solve for this entire thing? It's just light, and it's just, is light hitting the sensor or not? How much is hitting the sensor will be determined by, or the number of units of light that need to hit the sensor to make a meaningful impact, that will be determined by some of the variables that we're going to talk about in the next section. So just think of it as the more exposure, the brighter the image. The less exposure, the darker the image. And there are some technical formalities in there, but at the base level, that is all we are talking about. Traditionally, there are 6 different elements that will affect how much light is hitting the sensor at any given time on a film set. And unlike photography, the beautiful part is that a lot of these variables are set as a constant in cinematography. And that's a bonus because the less that we have to think about, specifically, the less that I have to think about, the easier things become, right? Because I'm not that smart. I can't juggle that many variables in my head. So for me, I think it's a benefit that a lot of these things are locked in place, at least from scene to scene. Maybe not from entire project to entire project, but for the most part, you will set up a scene and you will keep, out of the 6 different tools we have at our disposal, you will probably keep 5 of those constant, which only leaves 1, and one very important one, and the element that we're going to discuss most in this course. So those 6 tools are shutter speed, you've got aperture, you have your ISO or your ASA, you have your frame rate, you have neutral density or you have filtration, and then the 6th one is lighting. So on a film set, generally with frame rate, we're going to keep it at 24 or 25. Sometimes you will operate in other spaces, but across a given scene, you will probably lock in that frame rate. So we don't have to worry about that. You have your ASA or your ISO, your sensitivity of the sensor or the film stock. And generally, again, unless you are working in a natural light environment, you're going to have an ISO or an ASA that you stick to. So that is going to be controlled. And you have to think of it, every time we're locking one of these variables in place, we are going from an infinite number of possibilities to a slightly smaller window. Right? We're just shifting that window smaller and smaller. And what we're doing is we're trying to create a window which we will then manipulate only through the last variable. So we're deciding that all of the light, all of the options that we have for exposure are going to come in this little compact window, and we're going to set that up or down in terms of how much light we actually need based on these decisions. So frame rate, we can set. ISO, we can set. Aperture, we're probably going to keep the same across a given scene. Aperture is going to be the same. Then we have shutter speed. That's also going to be the same across a given, you can think of fringe outside use cases like Saving Private Ryan, or if you're doing some car work, or if you're doing sports work and you want motion blur, or you want less motion blur, but 99% of the time, you're going to set all of those things to a constant. And once they're a constant, then we can start to measure the key important variables and look to manipulate those. Because again, the whole reason that we're doing this is we want to be able to predict out into the future what the results are going to be of manipulating a number of different factors. And the lower we can keep those factors, the lower in possibilities, that means the more repeatable our future results are going to be. That makes us more valuable to the people around us, because what we want to do is we want to translate the vision that the director has in the real world for the final images that he or she might want, or the ideas that we have around how we're going to make someone feel or how we want the images themselves to feel. We're going to translate that into the language of the camera. And that language of the camera, that's learning how to expose. So that's exactly what we're doing here. So shutter speed, frame rate, ISO, aperture, then you have your neutral density filters. And again, if you're thinking in a scene by scene basis, you're not often changing ND in the middle of a scene. You will set all of your levels so that you can begin to build from there. If you were to ask electricians, if you were to ask gaffers what the single most annoying thing a cinematographer can do is when they're lighting a scene, as you're starting to build up what the look is going to be and start to build out that exposure, the most annoying thing you can do is start to filter with the camera. You start to play around with the levels because we want a solid foundation to build from. If we don't have a solid foundation for every scene to build from, well then all of the variables are just up for grabs and anything can change. So you don't know what you're affecting. There's so many different options with limiting the amount of light that is hitting the sensor or funneling the amount of light that is hitting the sensor that we want to lock these things in place. And then finally, that leaves lighting. And lighting is the big one. And that is the one that takes the most time to understand, to translate what I see in the real world. What does that mean when I look through the camera? And how is the camera going to interpret that? So, like I said before, you and I, we see the world completely differently now. But by the end of this course, you're going to, much like Neo in the Matrix, you're going to be able to decipher information in a way that is different than you do now. And that is going to help you speak camera better than you do right now, which will make you a better cinematographer. Now we've gone over what the traditional definition of exposure here is, but before we get into other elements of the course, I just want to pause and lay out how I think about exposure in my own mind. And when I think exposure, I don't think about those first 5 elements, those first 5 tools. I think about lighting. And very specifically, when I think about lighting, I think about ratios. I think about the relationship between one area of the frame and another area of the frame. Because what I am trying to do, or what I recognize as good cinematography, what my taste draws me towards, and what I'm trying to replicate on set, is anything but flat. I think flat is boring. I don't like looking at boring things. I don't like looking at flat things. I like to be drawn in with depth, and depth requires contrast, and it requires control, and it requires different light levels spread across the sensor in a pattern that is repeatable, and in a pattern that will help me to evoke an emotion that I'm going for. And I find the more depth that you can get inside of an image, the more compelling it is. And the more compelling it is, the more people want to see it. And the more people want to see it, the more jobs that I end up getting. And that's the whole point of all of this stuff, is to create better images so I can get more jobs, so I can continue to get better at all of the other things. And like I said, with exposure, you don't have to go out and do any of this stuff. To learn exposure, all you have to do is learn how to translate the final image and work backwards to how that must have been created, because the light cannot lie, right? There is no way to fudge exposure, at least for the time being. Before AI takes over the world, there's no way to go back and fudge it after you've done the process. So whatever is there in the final image, yes, it can be manipulated by the grading process, but it has to end up, those values have to be there for it to be compelling. And so we can take that information, we can simply look at the work that other people have done and glean all of the information necessary to then make future assessments on what values, what exposure is going to recreate that same feeling. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build up a Rolodex of these options available to us. And as we're going to see further along in the course, you would think, well, there's just a tremendous amount of optionality. There's so many different variables. There's so many different things that you can manipulate, when in reality, the more you look at things that you like, and the more you start to develop a sense of your own for images that you want to create, it ends up being a very limited number of options with a limited number of exposures. And then it's about not only recognizing those exposures, but then being able to choose from them. And the quicker you can do that, much like I said before about tying your shoes, the more you can do that in the background, the more value you become on set, because you can be open to other discussions. You can be ingesting other information that is not necessary for exposure conversations. That should just be done. It should just be taken care of. You should learn this stuff and never, ever have to worry about it again. This is not a tool that you will constantly be thinking about using, but it's a tool that you will use at all times. Like, as soon as you see the world this way, you can't unsee it. This is a transformation that you will not go back to the way that you were before. As soon as you understand these concepts, you will never be the same, and you will be a better cinematographer for it, because now you will see the world the way the camera sees the world, and you will be interpreting light the way the camera interprets light. And that really is the main goal of all of this. Okay, just to drive home this point a little bit more, let's just run through a thought experiment. What is limiting the amount of light that is hitting the sensor at any given time? What are the tools that are limiting that? Or what are the factors that are limiting that? Again, we've got the 6 things that we talked about previously. You've got your aperture, the lens, the amount of light that is traveling through the lens. You have your shutter speed. You have your ASA. You have your frame rate. You have the neutral density in front, the filtration in front of the lens itself, the little sunglasses. And you have the lighting. Those are the things that limit the amount of light. And what you have to remember is this idea of the Overton window, right? The Overton window, if you're not familiar with the theory, it is more around the concept of government policies and what things are top of mind, what things should be talked about in the public sphere and what things shouldn't be. And shifting the Overton window allows you to have discourse in the public world about different issues, different policies. And we can take that same idea and apply it to cinematography and apply it to light levels. Because what we need to do is this infinite amount of light that can hit the sensor. We can expose it for however long we want. We can expose it to any values that we would like. We need to begin to limit that so that we can make more detailed, more nuanced choices by the time we get to that 6th tool, which is lighting, right? Because that is where we can do the most manipulation that will allow us to create depth in this 2-dimensional world. Right? We can do the most damage with laying in our own creativity in that 6th variable. So we want to set all 5 things first. We want to have that strong foundation, and we want to take a huge amount of optionality, and we want to limit it into essentially the biggest bucket of dynamic range that we can get. Because with lots of dynamic range on a sensor, that means we have lots of different values, lots of different contrast areas that we can play with. And the more that we can play with those things and the more nuanced we can get, the quicker, the better it's going to be for us. So we set the frame rate, we set the shutter speed, we set the aperture, we set the frame rate, we do the ND. All of those things are done. And then it's about, if we can do those repeatedly at the same levels, we have a building block to then spring forth our ideas on lighting. We know what a stop under is going to look like. We know what a stop over is going to look like. And now we can start to build up this Rolodex of different exposure options. Like, what does the background look like 2 stops under? What does the background look like 3 stops under? It doesn't matter what the camera is. It doesn't matter what the lenses are. All of those creative decisions about how we're going to interact with the light and how the file is going to look afterwards, after that processing has been done, none of that matters to the exposure side of things. We just need to know light levels. That's it. And how they relate to one another in very close quarters. So that's how you create contrast. That's how you create roundness in a 2-dimensional frame, is you have that contrast feathered out over a certain area. Right? You can imagine painting with light on the sensor. That's all we're doing, is we're telling it where to have brighter values, where to have darker values. And you would think, again, there's just limitless options. You could never develop a system to be able to reliably explain what something might look like in the future with just a few different templates. But that just isn't the case. At least it's not the case in my own experience, right? I keep on coming back to the same contrast ratios, to the same light levels. And as I do, I can start to accurately predict what things will look like in the future. And that makes me better at determining what exposure is going to be necessary to align with whatever feeling the director, myself, the rest of the production wants to impose on the final image, on the final scene. So that is what we are doing here. We're just trying to take a whole bunch of options, and we're trying to put them in a little tiny box. Well, the biggest box that we can. And once we're inside that repeatable box, then we can start to play with some of these ideas to develop a system, like a river of options that have lots of different offshoots, but we know where all of those offshoots lead, because that is where you'll start to see the efficiency increase, right? That's where you start to see the turnover. It's not doing this study initially. It's going to be frustrating. You're not going to be able to join all the dots. It's going to seem like there's just a limitless number of options that you can choose from. And there won't be, there will be no rhyme or reason why one thing works and one thing doesn't. But the more that you chip away, the more that you start to change how you see the world, you're going to start to get an understanding of, okay, X leads to Y, Y leads to Z. All of these patterns start to make sense. And if I want a certain look, I know I need these 4 elements, or I know I need these 3 figures or these 3 numbers. Because again, that's all we're talking about, right? This is just simple math. That's all there is in exposure. It's just numbers. It's just relationships between lighting levels. That's all there is that creates shape. So Once you understand this, you can sit anywhere and do it. You don't have to be on film sets to do this stuff. Once you master this, you will be able to create images of any style, in any pattern, in any way, without any of the tools necessary. You can just think in your head different lighting levels, and you can begin to pull images and pull shapes into that world just based on lighting ratios. Try and lay out what I think the reason behind developing a system for exposure is important. And I'm going to try and convince you that doing so, investing this time to become a master of exposure, is going to be beneficial to your entire career. And it's not going to be easy, right? This time is not, you can't fast forward through this. No one can learn exposure for you. You have to develop the skill. But once you develop the skill, then you are going to, again, never have to think about it again and never have to go through that process. And it's going to inform every single decision that you make for the rest of your life on set. So we're going to talk about developing this system and buying into the idea that this is worth the time and the effort because it will make you massively more efficient versus the work that you invest in developing this system. Then I'm going to lay out my own system, the ways that I see the world and the translations that are made possible because of it. And once you see this system and understand it, you can take parts of it and make them your own. You can take the entire system and make it your own and see this world the exact same way. And then from there, we're going to learn how to then apply this to your own learning environment. So say, okay, how can I take this information and this system, and then how can I go through the necessary repetitions in the quickest way possible, in the most efficient way possible, to start to onboard these skills into my own mind, creating my own framework for exposure. And then finally, we're going to go and talk about usage. Now, once you have developed a skill, how can you use it on set to leverage it to get the most out of your time on set? Because again, even after you learn these things, you still have to then be able to find a way to implement this newfound information into the set environment. And there are good ways to do that. There are ways that make you a better cinematographer, and there are ways that can slow you down. And I've experienced both of those. And the goal of those sections is to make sure that you don't have to follow through with those same mistakes. You can be aware of them, at least, even if you don't take the advice, you can at least be aware that those are on the radar and those are coming up, and you will face opportunities where you have the ability to go one way or the other. And if you chose the path that I did and make these mistakes, then you know why, as opposed to just avoiding them altogether. So we're going to talk about the development of the system. I'm going to explain to you my system for doing these things. I'm going to show you how I learned this and how you should learn it as well. Because even if I explain the system to you, it doesn't do you any good if you know what the system is. You have to make it a part of your thinking process. Right? I can't see for you. You have to learn how to see. So I'm going to explain the process of learning how to see. Then you're going to go out into the real world and you're going to do these things and then apply them on set, both on set and in post-production, because nowadays, certainly the job of the cinematographer and the job of exposing is not limited to on-set. That carries into the post-production world. And from there, the journey is limitless about how often and how hard you can push these ideas to make yourself the best cinematographer possible. I will be the first to admit that I am a systems person when it comes to cinematography. And I'm a systems person because I'm not that smart. Right? I cannot hold as many options as there are available to cinematographers in a specific scene, let alone an entire project. I can't hold all those variables in my head and make what I think is the best decision. So I need to make it as simple and as basic as possible. And how do you make anything simple or basic? You remove as many variables as you can. So the idea around developing a way to learn exposure and then use that system to help me expose in the real world, or to even to identify how I want to expose in the real world, it's just a process of elimination. How can we eliminate as many variables as possible? And then with the remaining variables, how do we develop a map so that I can decide either on set, which was less than ideal, or beforehand when I'm in the cool calmness of pre-production? How can I decide how I want to expose? And then once I decide how I want to expose, how do I figure out how I'm actually going to do that? Okay, because I need to come up with a look in my own mind, And I come up with that look through determining how we're going to expose. Right? That's exactly what you're doing when you develop a look. The look is the exposure. Once you do that, well, then it's developing a map that will get me to repeatable results without me having to think about it. Because there's so many different things on set. There's so many different things in pre-production that you are going to have to be involved in, conversations that you are going to have. And the less mental energy that you have to, again, back to the tying of your shoes analogy, if you don't have to expend mental energy on tying your shoes, if you don't have to expend mental energy on exposure choices or exposure values, well, then that allows you to project those resources elsewhere to become more effective in other areas, which you most certainly will. Even if you're starting now as a single-man band or a single-person band, you can project out into the future that if you want to do bigger jobs, you're going to get more questions, right? The questions that you have now in your head as you're walking around just by yourself, capturing images, you're going to get those from other individuals. You're going to have to communicate with those people, the ratios, the values, the look, the feel that you want. And that is going to take energy. So a film set is a time-poor area. It's a time-poor place. You are never going to have an abundance of time for anything. So the more efficient you can be with your energy, the better off. So while it might seem daunting at the beginning, right, because it might seem like there's an infinite number of exposure options, the goal of developing this system, learning how to see as the camera sees, is to take all of those options and make them into a very predictable chart, a flow chart that you can then A and B, right? If you can make a decision between A and B, that's significantly easier than making a decision between A and Z, right? I know, even my own pea-brain mind can make a decision between A and Z. I can pick, which one do I like better, A or B? Well, don't have to devote a whole lot of mental energy to that decision. A to Z, with all of those different options, it's just too much for my mind to juggle. So I want to develop a flow chart for how many decisions, how many A, B decisions do I have to make for a project, for a scene, for a look, in exposure terms to get to the final outcome. And that is what we are going to do in this course, and that's the whole reason why. So this is just a heads up that it might take a little bit of time at the beginning, but again, you never have to relearn this. Once you see that bottom row of the flow chart, all of the final destinations laid out, all of the combinations that could possibly occur, you not only can see, well, these are the options available to me, but then you start to develop your own taste. Out of all of these options, out of all these 100 options, which ones do I actually prefer? Which do I want to lean into? And why do I want to lean into those? Maybe for this specific project, maybe there's a feeling in one that I wouldn't typically be drawn to that would work well for this project. That makes you more valuable to the production, to the director, to the producer, to everyone around you if you're able to do this. So that is why we are developing a system, because we want to eliminate variables and spring from the same foundation every single time, right? Even the word, why do you have a foundation in the first place, right? It's to build, to have a system in place that allows you to get repeatable results. We want to eliminate anything going wrong, any of the possibilities that might go wrong through changing other variables outside of, again, there's 6 tools that we have access to on set to be able to control the amount of light hitting the sensor. And if we keep 5 of them constant, well, then we only have to deal with 1. And now we can really focus in on, okay, what are the elements that affect that 1? And lighting is going to be the key, and ratios are going to be, even inside of that box, even narrower. This is what we have to think about. This is what we have to identify. And now, if you only have 4 questions for every single image, well, that's significantly easier than an infinite pile of questions. So we've touched on why you want this system. Now let's talk about how we're going to develop this system, how we're going to move forward to better understanding of exposure, of the options that we have available to us, of building that foundation, and then what to do when we have it. So how we're going to do it has changed. It has changed from the time that I developed this system. Back when I started to try and learn exposure, the tools and the resources were limited, and that meant that they were less efficient. I had to spend longer and get poorer results than are available now. Right? This is the benefit that you have and that this course provides. So we're going to do it in two different ways. And really, back in the old days, you only had one option, right? You had to do it the old technique of a light meter. You had to get a light meter out. You had to understand the ratios. You had to set those first 5 variables in place, and then only focus on the lighting and the ratios and the contrast inside of the scene. The problem with doing it the analog way is that it takes an enormous amount of time to, number one, measure the results using a light meter, then to get the results back. So you had to expend energy in actually doing the process, and then you had to wait for the results, and then you had to marry those two up, and you had to take detailed notes, and it was incredibly slow, and you couldn't really learn from anyone else. You couldn't learn from any other cinematographer unless you had personal access to that cinematographer so that they could share with you what the ratios that they were shooting on a particular film stock were. Okay, that, luckily for us, that is no longer the case. The fantastic thing about exposure today and the tools that we have access to today is that the exposure of any finished product that we can view online, they cannot lie, right? We can measure the exposure to the exact values that, okay, yes, maybe not that they got on set, but that they got after the grade. And I would argue that the values that they want post-shooting, so after the grade, those are more important than the values that they got on the actual day, right? Because that's what the cinematographer is going for, especially if we're looking at like a large feature film. Sometimes you just don't have the resources or the capabilities to get the exact values and the ratios or the exposure that you want on the day for a given area of the sensor. It's just not going to be possible. It's not feasible. It's not practical. It doesn't match up with the budget. It's just a complete waste of time. That sometimes happens, right? That's a reality. But they fix that in the grade, and they get the ratios that they want, the ratios between different areas of the frame to give off the mood that they desire. So it becomes infinitely easier if we can now see that in real time for any project. So what do we have to do with that information? Well, we have to look at it. We have to analyze it. We have to come up with a pattern, and then we have to come up with a technique for taking those patterns and then projecting them out into the future into our own work. So like I said at the beginning of the course, you don't have to shoot anything. You don't have to go outside. You don't have to do anything if you have access to these tools, and everyone has access to the tools that we're going to be talking about. But is that the most efficient way to go about it? No, which is why we're going to take a two-prong approach. We're going to look at the analog approach. We're going to look at the using a light meter approach, because the language of lighting is spoken in a very specific way on film sets. If you don't know that language, you're going to be at a disadvantage, right? You're always going to have to speak through a translator, and you don't want that. Why? Because it creates friction. It creates friction between you and other members of the crew, and friction decreases speed, which decreases efficiency, which means you get less than optimum results. So we're going to learn a very quick and easy technique with a light meter, and then how to use that information to make ourselves better at understanding ratios. And then we're going to look at the modern tools, things like false color, to, again, develop a system for repeatable maps of where exposure choices might lead to and what the effects of those choices are going to be. So that is how we are going to progress here in this two-prong approach so that we can maximize efficiency. You don't have to use a light meter, but again, I think that puts you at a major disadvantage. You don't have to use the false color techniques that we're going to talk about, but that puts you at a huge, enormous disadvantage. Just imagine having to go out and shoot all of the tests necessary, all of the things that we're going to talk about the various ratios. We basically need to go through every single ratio combination to develop our own sense of what we do and don't like. And to do that, it's a lot of options. Okay, we're going to narrow it down really, really quickly, because you'll see, even though it seems like an infinite number of options, if we hold those first 5 variables constant and we only focus on the lighting, in the end, using the display technology that we have access to now, it's really not that many. But it's one of those things that once you see it, you can't unsee it, and it's just going to take practice. Because to get the maximum benefit out of this, it's not being able to identify different areas of a frame that you are looking at to try and then replicate. It's knowing what those results are going to be without even thinking about it, right? It has to be split second, because then if you're actually having to think about it and digest this stuff on set, you're missing 95% of the benefit of learning how to master exposure, right? Well, you haven't mastered exposure at that stage. Maybe you can understand exposure, but the goal is to have it just as quick as you can, as quick as you can think. This is the solution. These are the levels that I need. These are the ratios that I need. And if I have those things, then I can think about other stuff. So that's how we're going to go about this system. And we're going to look at the various pros and cons of each, the technique behind each, and then use that to project out into the future on your own projects. Did repeatedly so far in the course up until now that we are not going to concern ourselves with the first 5 elements of exposure, right? We are going to imagine those holding constant across a project. We're not going to change those. Those are fringe, outlier use cases. Maybe they'll come up 1% of the time, but for getting the maximum benefit out of understanding and maximizing our understanding of exposure, really all we have to do is concentrate on lighting. And if we concentrate on lighting, then what are the elements inside of lighting that we need to focus on, right? Well, are there infinite number of options inside of that? Well, the answer, obviously, is no. That would be a hard system if it was infinite number of options. We only have 4, right? 4 key areas of measurement that we are going to play off of one another. So their ratios in comparison to one another, those are going to be the things that set the mood, the look, and ultimately the quality of our exposure and the quality of our final images. So those 4 things are the key, the fill, the backlight, and the background. Those 4 elements, if we can think about lighting and light levels and the ratios of the key to the fill, the key to the backlight, the key to the background. If we can think about those 4 measurements, that is going to tell us all we need. And that is the true power of the system. It's only 4 things. If you understand those 4 things and you can think in your mind when you see an image, if you can see those 4 things, if you can understand those 4 ratios, you can replicate any image that you see, any image that you can think of. It comes down to those 4 major inputs. And it doesn't seem like a lot. In fact, that's true because it's not a lot. But those combinations, as you're going to see as we go through the various stops and as we go through the various measurement cycles, it's important to remember that's all we're measuring all the time, to concern ourselves with anything that has to do with the look, right? The quality of the light, okay, that's a different discussion. The shape of the light, that's a different discussion. What we're talking about here is levels and ratios of those levels to one another, because it's the ratios that create the shape. And I talked about the ultimate goal of quality exposure is fighting flatness. So if the key is the same as the fill, is the same as the background, is the same as the backlight, what happens is you get no contrast across the image. And so if you want to increase contrast, we are going to increase the difference, increase the ratio from the key to the fill, from the key to the background, from the key to the backlight. All of those 4 elements, those can be adjusted up and down. And you'll think, well, okay, this is going to be complicated because there's so many different options inside of that. How are we going to develop this map that we have to develop a template for? This is what the end result is going to be. That seems like there's a lot of options in there. It gets even more condensed than that. And as you're quickly going to find out in the next section when we talk about the exposure tree, the number of different combinations gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And I can tell you these things, and I can show you in the next section in the exposure tree, but you aren't going to believe me until we actually get into reviewing images and looking at your own work and getting in to use the light meter so that we can see that, yes, it is in fact very, very limited in scale, but the results can be broad ranging. And as soon as we know certain key information about those 4 numbers, then we can really start to build a strong foundation for developing looks and understanding looks and all of the necessary components that will then be required to create those looks. So it's 4 key inputs that are going to be key for the rest of this course. Key light, fill light, backlight, and background. Those things in relationship to one another is what is going to allow you to master exposure. Just to drive home the point about setting up the first 5 elements that control exposure on set to form a foundation from which to understand exposure from. I just want to jump in here and show you this scale. Now, the numbers don't mean anything, right? These are just stops along a scale from pure black to pure white. And what we are doing when we set those first 5 elements is we are putting a box around the expectations that the camera has. So we're saying, camera, expect this information to come in this box. So we're setting all of those things to then maximize whatever the dynamic range that the camera can capture. We are saying, okay, expect this information coming in this format. And once we have set this box, then the lighting is what takes over and distributes to the different buckets. And you can think of each one of these stops as different buckets that we are going to fill up across the sensor. So this is where, the key light is going to occupy one of these areas. The fill light is going to occupy one of these areas. The background is going to occupy one of these areas. And the backlight is going to occupy one of these areas. Now, how those things match up and how the relationship they have to one another. Let's say the key light is going to be at 40 on the scale, right? And this, again, the numbers don't actually matter. These could be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. All we're going to look at for the time being is how they relate to one another. You can use whatever form is easy enough for you to understand. I think in stops, you can do foot candles, you can read the scale, you can just make up the scale on your own based on whatever false color plugin that we're going to be looking at, or whatever camera you're using. It doesn't matter. All that matters is that we are able to use the same scale all the time because we're measuring the relationship between stops, okay? So let's say your key is at 40, okay? Then the next question we say is, okay, now that we have established that the key light is at 40, then we need to look at what is the fill light relative to the key light. Is the key light brighter than the fill? If it is, then the fill is going to go here. Right? Say it's a stop, brighter. Well, then the fill is there. What about the backlight? Is the backlight darker, going that way, or is it brighter, going this way? Okay, let's say it's brighter. So this is going to be the backlight. I should have made this a K. So the backlight is going to be 1, 2 stops over. Okay? Again, just measuring these in stops of light. And what about the background? Well, let's say the background is going to be 3 stops under. Okay, so background. So the background is 3 stops under, the fill is 1 stop under, and the key light is at key, which we're going to talk about later on. But then the backlight is 2 stops over. Okay, so those 4 things and this relationship happen inside of the container that you set with those first 5 elements. So that's why, again, like the Roger Deakins and shooting at 800 ISO on the Alexa for many, many years, Roger Deakins has shot every single project at 800 ISO. Why? Because it's a variable that you never have to think about again. You just set it, you forget it, you use that as a springboard from which to make lighting decisions, from which to make ratio decisions, which is what we're going to talk about in the next section. It seems like, well, if you have a scale here of these 10 different relationships, these 10 different options of stops, right? You talk about most cameras these days have north of 13 stops of dynamic range. There's lots and lots of options in there. But what you find is that there's patterns that happen again and again and again. Very rarely, you're not going to have a key light at 40, at 4, let's say, versus a background that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stops over. Okay, we're going to look at lots and lots of examples in this course. You're never, I'll tell you right now, you're never going to see this relationship. Right? So we can eliminate that from having to think about it because it's so far overexposed, the background is so far overexposed to the key light that it doesn't look good, so we eliminate it. And we don't have to think about that option anymore because it's too extreme. Or you're never going to have the key light at 4 and the fill at 5 over, or the fill at 4 over. That just doesn't happen. I mean, you could do it, it just doesn't look very nice. So we don't really want to concern ourselves with those options. We don't have to get intimately familiar with what a scene would look like if the key level is at 4 and the fill is 5 stops over 4. Okay, so this is where we can start to use this filtration system to develop our own taste, to be able to eliminate options, eliminate variables, because that makes the choices easier. So in the next section, I'm going to go over the basic, what I call the exposure tree. These are the options that are going to come up that I find pleasing to my eye, that are going to come up over and over and over again. And this really is the sandbox that you play in as a cinematographer, certainly that I play in. It's like I would not, unless it was an extreme edge case, I would not vary outside the boxes of the exposure tree. And that's what we're going to see in the next installment, so that hopefully you can get a better idea of what to expect when we do look at the light meter and how to use it, and when we do look at false color, so that we can get these predictable patterns ingrained in our minds. All right, this is where things start to get fun, and this is where patterns start to emerge, and I think where the real strength of the system begins to shine. So what is the exposure tree? We talked about the 4 inputs that you have to be tracking in any given scene while you're analyzing any image, whether you're on set with a light meter, whether you're on set using false color, whether you're using false color just looking and reviewing other people's footage. These are the numbers that you have to concern yourself. This is the range that you have to concern yourself. And this is important because, again, we're eliminating options. So let's jump in here. And why do I call it a tree? Well, I call it a tree because it ends up looking a little bit like this Christmas tree pattern. Okay? And how does that happen? Well, we're going to take the most important ingredient, which is the key light. Because normally, with the key light, it has the least amount of leeway left and right of whatever you're going to set your lens at, right? So let's say the aperture that we're going to choose to shoot a scene at is 2.8. So this is T2.8 that we have decided to shoot this scene. That is really, out of the 5 different constants, the one that we're going to change the most is aperture, right? Because sometimes you want a shallow depth of field, sometimes you might want it deeper. Even there, like in today's modern cinema, maybe your options are 1.3 through 5.6, right? Like edge cases, maybe you're shooting 8 or 11 for macro or for some food stuff, but this is generally the range, which means you've got, 6 stops in there, maybe, at a maximum that you have at your options. But those are for artistic choices, and those are legitimate uses of the tools to say, well, do we want shallow depth of field? Do we not? Those are questions outside of exposure. Once we set that on the lens, right? Once we set T2.8 is going to be where we're going to be shooting this. That's the last of the 5 variables probably that we're going to set, and then that develops our base. So when something is at key, that means that we are measuring the light on set, and it is telling us that 2.8 is going to equal middle gray. So that's the reading that we're going to get on our light meter, again, which we're going to show you later on. But I want to bring this up now because it's important that you see how we're eliminating options and how this tree forms, so we can focus our energy into a much narrower band of examination. So T2.8 on the lens, and say on the light meter, it gives us T2.8. So that means that on our scale is 0, right? That's at key. That's what I call it, at key. If it reads 2.8, 2.8 on the lens, that means that is at key. Now we have a sliding scale, and the sliding scale is not tied to the dynamic range of the camera. The sliding scale is set to stops that are then going to be able to be perceived in the final display. And working in something like Rec 709, it's a maximum of 6 stops, but maybe you can finesse some of the things and project 14 stops inside of those 6 stops. I'm going to say, for my own system, I use 0, -1, -2, -3, -4. Okay? And then on the plus side, I use +1, +2, +3, +4. That is the scale that we are going to use. And what this scale means, again, just to repeat it, is if we are -1 on the scale, that is, again, let's say this is 2.8. This is going to be 1 stop under 2.8, right? So that's going to read 2.0. This is going to read 1.3. Okay, this is going to read 7.7. Okay, same thing up the scale. This is going to read 4s, 5, 6s, 8s. Okay, all the way up the scale. So it's only really -4 to +4. That's the scale that we are using. How is that at all beneficial to us? How is this not already confusing? Well, let's go back to our 4 inputs that we're going to be measuring in this entire course. We've got our key light, okay? Key light is going to be at the top of the tree. Again, I'll sort of draw it out here just so we can keep track. You've got your key light. You've got your fill. It's going to be the next level. Then you have your backlight. And then you have your background, okay? So the key light is the least amount of flexibility. In all of the images that I like, it's very rare that you would have the key light. Let's make a map like that. Something like that. And then that. Okay, these are the different buckets. Key light, very, very rare that you would have something that was, say, -1, 0, or a +1. Okay, so that's the smallest number of options. Generally, it's going to be at key, it's going to be maybe a stop below, maybe a stop above. But you're not going to have a key light. Again, we're talking about the 99% of the use cases. You're not going to have a key light that is 4 stops over on purpose. You're not going to have a key light that is 3 stops under on purpose. Yes, there will be times where, I don't know, you can think of someone moving through a scene and they might fall into an area. You might think of an incredibly dark scene where there's going to be a silhouette. Yes, those are options, but we're talking about the majority of the use cases. So you're going to have the key light level is going to be at key. It's going to be a stop under key or a stop over. The fill, well, now we start to project out the options. Now, are you going to ever get a key light or a fill light that is 4 stops over in a traditional image, like one that I'm drawn to, one that we're going to look at? No. Generally, the fill is going to be under the key. If the fill is over the key light, if the fill is over the key levels, well then it's not really the fill light, right? That becomes the key light. So by definition, the fill has to be under the key. So that limits, again, the number of possibilities. So if it's at 0, you sort of have a very flat image. You can imagine someone's face, right? Or imagine shooting a mannequin, some stills that we're going to look at later on in the course. You're shooting a medium shot of a mannequin. If the fill light is at 0, it's a very flat image. If it's a stop under, okay, well now we have a little variation. We have a little bit of contrast on the face. If it's 2 stops under, okay, we've got more. If it's 3, we've got more. And if it's 4, okay. We're going down in level, increasing the contrast, which as we go later on in the course and we look at different images, you can see that this increases the amount of mood, it increases the drama. Depending on the quality of the light, things start to really shift. But all we're concerned about now is the ratios. So if we're shooting a key, and I know, just off the top of my head, I know what a key at key looks like, which is 0. Key at key equals 0. And a fill at a stop under. You should already know what that looks like, right? You're going to already know what that looks like by the end of your study into mastering exposure. You're also going to know what a key at key looks like and what a fill at -2 stops looks like. Okay, that is the point we're trying to get to. From there, we go into the backlight. Now, the backlight does have more options, right? The backlight, you can get situations where the backlight is over the key. So now that's the second layer, the second to last layer of the pyramid, where, okay, yes, sometimes you can have it at key. Sometimes it's going to be +1. Sometimes it's going to be +2, +3, +4. Probably not, right? -1, -2, -3 on a backlight. Iffy, right? Maybe we can cancel out some of those, but there's slightly more variation in the backlight. So that's something that we want to be aware of so that we can recognize those moments. Okay, there's going to be more variation in the backlight. And every time there's a different combination. Like if it's, let's say this is 0, -2, +3, right? That's a certain look already. You're going to be able to see that look just off of those 3 numbers. Then what happens after that is you've got background. Background is going to have the most variation. And when we talk about background, which you can also substitute for room tone in certain instances, the background, it's more the general level. So I would take the average of the background, because in the background, we're going to talk about, you probably want variance. Well, you don't probably want, you definitely want variance most of the time, as to, you're not just going to have the entire, if you're looking at a medium shot, like this shot of me, and you're looking at the background back there, you don't want just one level, right? You don't want just minus 2 stops in the background, okay? Because that's going to be real flat. We want pops and different levels of color, but for the purposes of coming up with a look, the biggest thing is the average. What is the average level? Because the brighter it is, the more distracting it's going to be. The darker it is, the more you're going to solo in on and key in on whatever the subject is. So a lower number makes you focus more. Too low makes it too flat. So this has the most variance. So let's say this one goes -4, -3, -2, -1, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay? So the most amount of options is going to be in the background. And sometimes you'll have, like, probably, let's say, -2. This look, 0, -2, +3, -2. That's a look, right? That's one of our options. Another option is going to be 0, -3, -2, +1. Okay, that's another option. Those 4 numbers. Just by looking at those numbers, you're going to be able to see what those results are. And this is how you can quickly cycle through the various options. It's like, okay, let's see. We need some contrast, and it has to be moody. Well, it's probably going to be a 0. It's probably going to be a 0, -3, maybe -1, just to give it a little bit of shape. And then in the background, it's going to be -3. So now you can really start to dial in these levels, and we come up with a predictable pattern of things that we can quickly analyze to be able to project onto the future options that we have at our disposal. So this is the framework that we are going to go and use for all of the images that we look at. And what this means is, this is where, I mentioned earlier in the course, where you start to see, like Neo in the Matrix, you start to see the streaming numbers across the frame, right? The light levels that we're going to be examining when we look at other people's work, and we're going to look at things in false color, but it's also good to just think of things in these 4 buckets, and really this range, right? Of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 options, right? Those 9 numbers, you can imagine them falling across the screen on all of the levels, because they're just falling on the sensor at these levels. That's all we need to know. That's all we need to be looking at. And you can create you could create a face out of this. If you think about it, like let's say this is a person, right? How am I going to draw this person? I'm going to draw this gentleman here, right? Rather than seeing these faces, like this is just a guy, right? Rather than seeing this, what do you see is you see zeros for his face, right? You see 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, zeros everywhere. And then you see -2, -2, -2, -2, -2, -2, -2, -2, -2, -2, and these start to take shape like a pointillist painting, right? These numbers start to actually form the shapes. And then in the background, you see -3, -3, -3, +1, +1, +1, right? Like that becomes a light bulb back there. And then you've got -3, -3, all the way across the background. Maybe up here on the backlight, you've got a +2, +2. And you see these numbers just falling across the screen. This is all we have to concern ourselves with. This is the entire thing. If you understand this concept, which I know, especially now when I'm drawing on here, it looks a little bit confusing. As soon as we start looking at images, you're gonna be like, I see exactly what you're saying. And this is strong because now all I have to do is think about the various combinations of these 4 things, and all of a sudden I'm a master at exposure, and no one else knows this information. Right? It's not that complicated. It's not that hard. It's just, if you know it, it's not that beneficial. You have to be able to put it into practice, like tying your shoes. You have to be able, it has to be this fast. It has to be, we need more mood. What are we gonna do? Well, let's drop this from -2 to -3. Or it's supposed to be it's supposed to be a dark scene overall. Okay, well, let's go -2 on the key light. Let's go 2 stops under on the key, and then set all of our ratios, because everything that works at key, right? All of our, let's say we're gonna be at key, and then we're gonna be 2 stops under on the fill, and then we're going to be a stop over on the backlight, and then we're going to be 2 stops under on the background. All of these ratios to each other, this relationship of 2 stops here, of 1 stop there, that works if we set this at -2, right? We just take everything and slide it down, all the numbers and slide them down accordingly, right? That's all we have to do to get that same mood just lower, right? So it's just stepping down in scale. So it's even less options, really. If you know the at key options, you can just apply those to darker or brighter up the scale based on the key, right? Because that is the main level that all of the other 3 lights are based on. So -2, -2, -1. Again, already I can see it. Already you can see the image. 0, +1, all of a sudden, that's the key light now. That's looking a little bit funky. +3, oh no, that's a hot backlight. +3, that's a funky looking scene. Like, you probably don't want any part of that scene. So, okay, well, what things do we need to change? Immediately, we probably don't want the fill that high. Okay, so let's knock 2 stops out of that or 3 stops out of that. These are how you make the decisions, basically. And as soon as you see this, and then you can apply it to other people's work, you can reproduce those results because there is no lying with exposure. The images that we analyze, those are what they had to be on the day or in the grade, which also translates to what the cinematographer actually wanted from the scene. And if we reproduce those numbers exactly, guess what? It's going to turn out the exact same way. Now, it might not be the exact same image, right? You're going to have different compositional elements. You're going to have different framing, different lenses, different all of those things. But those differences, that's where you want to be focusing your energy when you're actually there on the day. You don't want to have to be worrying about these exposure levels and the ratios between them that then go on to create the mood, because there's other things to worry about. Well, I have decided that this course is trying to kill me. The amount of things that have gone wrong with me trying to film this course have been through the roof. So I don't know if it's the world not wanting me to share this information or what it is, but it started out with a little gray hair I had in my beard that all of a sudden, after I filmed an entire section, I realized it looked like I had something coming out of my nose when it was in fact just my gray hair. Next up was the first cut on my nose, then the second cut on my nose. Then I got bashed in the face with a knee in jiu-jitsu. That resulted in all of my entire eye turning black. And now, yesterday, I got hit again in the face in jiu-jitsu. So all of the marks, progressively, you'll see me by the end of this. I won't even be recognizable. Fingers crossed. That's not the case. Okay, but that's why I look weird. Anyway, I don't want to waste any more time. Let's talk about the idea of this box that I don't think I have put enough emphasis on just how important understanding this idea is with the first 5 elements of exposure. So shutter speed, ASA, aperture, ND, all of these things that are contained within the camera. The importance of understanding the difference between the box and the distribution phase. The distribution phase is the lighting, right? That's going to be extremely important, and that is where 99% of the creativity will flow through that distribution phase. The box, though, is important in 2 different areas. 2 different areas. You have to understand what you're doing when you define this box. The first one is defining the overall world. Like, how much are we actually going to physically cap, and it is physically cap the amount of light that is coming in to the sensor, because that is where we're then going to build the world through distribution. So at the beginning of a scene, sometimes at the beginning of a project, you'll go through this process of testing, and it's different with every single camera, which is why, we don't really need to go into the specifics of setting up the box, because it's specific to a certain camera. There'll be some times where if we think about, okay, well, where would it be advantageous to purposefully move the box? And actually, to talk about this, we might want to just jump in here to this distribution of stops again. And I have talked about this many times on the podcast. It's become a famous idea now about the distribution of stops over a given ISO in a camera, right? You would think that as you bump up the ISO, it becomes more sensitive, which means you're going to get more stops in the shadows. That's in fact the opposite, right? For a whole host of reasons. Hopefully you know this by now. If not, you can check the podcast. But as you increase the ISO, what you're doing is you're eliminating stops in the shadows. Okay, so that's not what you want to do. If you want to fill up these, imagine the photosites on a sensor being buckets that hold the light. We do not want to artificially fill those buckets with electricity, with signal, before we expose for them for a night interior, right? If they're buckets and we want the maximum amount of information in those buckets, the maximum amount of light, we don't want to artificially fill them. And that's what we're doing when we increase the ISO. Okay, so you don't want to do that. So in a time like that, you have to have the technical understanding to say, okay, how do I get the maximum amount of bucket space for this given scene? Number one, does it actually matter? Right? 9 times out of 10, when you're exposing a scene, it won't matter. You just stick to the recommendation, like Roger Deakins, you shoot 800. There's going to be more than enough distribution, especially with modern cameras. You'll never have to concern yourself with that. But there are times when, yes, you will need to do this. I use it for exposing for darker scenes and exposing for extremely contrasty scenes outside when you don't have all of the control that you would like. I go, generally, more often than not, I do the opposite. Right, I will do the opposite because I will set my ISO much higher, thereby getting much more distribution in the highlights of a sensor. That allows me not to clip when I'm outside. You can do more that way, but you have to know that information. So that's the beginning phase of the box. You have to set all those elements up so that you know inside of this world of exposure, then we're going to be distributing the values to the exact stop, to the exact bucket height that I want in each bucket to get the desired results. Then there's a second time where it becomes useful to understand all of those elements that affect the box, because as the lighting happens on set, right? Say you've developed your formula, you know your template for the lighting that you want to recreate. You know it's going to be a 0, -2, -2, -3, right? A classic formula, I would say, which we're going to definitely look into all these different branches. But that is in the distribution phase, right? We've established a distribution template that we want for the lighting given our system that we are developing. The problem is, well, what if we get in there and it just isn't sitting right, right? There's something wrong. And there's something wrong is not in the distribution. Like say, again, come back to this scene here. Say we've decided that our key is going to be here, and then we've got our fill, which is going to be stop under, let's say, and then 2 stops under. We're going to have our backlight, and then the background is also going to be 2 stops under, right? So a different formula. Let's just say it still feels just a little bit too bright. It feels too exposed. What then do we want to do at the very end, right? Because as we're building up this look, these ratios, the relationship to one another, that doesn't change as we slide the scale up and down, right? As we move the scale from here to then, oh, I just erased it all, to there, those ratios, they just shift up a scale. So the time that it is nice and the time that you have to then make changes, especially with things like ND, but more often than not with digital cameras, I find myself doing this with ISO because I am not someone that will just stick it at 800. I will stick it at 800 to do the creation. But then as we're going into the last minute things, especially on the size of the sets that I'm on, it's like we don't have time to go in there and, again, let's say we are here and we're going to do this whole thing. We're just imagining it as our stops. So we're going to go key at key, and then we're going to go 2 under for the fill. Then we're going to go 2 under for the backlight, and then the background's going to be 3 under. Okay, so this is our distribution. If I don't like the way that it's looking or the way that it's feeling or where it's sitting in the world overall, I like the ratios, I like all of this stuff, but it would be nice if it was just a stop darker, right? It makes no sense for me to go around and have every single light adjusted, a stop down, to be able to get all of this information just down 1 row, right? It makes much more sense if you know the tools that you are working with and what you can and can't get away with. It makes so much more sense to just go down on the camera, right? Because it's a much more localized problem. I can fix it here with just a few adjustments on the camera or a few adjustments in terms of neutral density, or you probably wouldn't go shutter speed, right? There's a hierarchy that you're going to go down. Number 1 would be if you're shooting on something like the Venice or anything that has internal NDs, it's just going to be to change the ND, right? Instantaneous, super fast. You don't even have to tell anybody. You just do it. Next, after that, is going to be where I would lean. I would just go ISO, right? But to be successful at this, you have to know what you're doing. Like under the hood, what are you actually doing when you change the ISO? Yes, you are changing the way that you see the amount of information that is hitting the sensor. And if you're working on a project where you're not going to be involved in the grade, and this is being passed off to a colorist and it's commercial, and you need to set that look, well, then now is the time to do it. If it's on something longer, it's a feature film where you're going to be there the entire time and you're shooting in RAW or whatever it might be, there are certain times where you wouldn't want to do that. But it's just knowing the situation. And to do that, it's important. The box is important at the front, setting the world, and then at the very end. Like, what adjustments can I make that can speed this up? So it's not just a set and forget. It's slightly more complicated than that, like everything in cinematography. But I just wanted to hammer home that point that, yes, look at the beginning, look at the end, in the middle, let's worry about the relationship and the ratios between the lighting so that then we can start to build out our options. Because here, really the only thing that we have to be aware of, or the only thing that you're measuring in terms of look as it relates to the box is, again, this is our entire distribution. Where do I like the key here? It's the key ratio to the box, right? Because our box is basically our exposure. That's what we're setting the camera at. Let's say, again, for our example, let's say it's going to be at 2.8, and we want the key at 2.8. That's what we're setting the lens to. That's what we're going to read on our light meter. That's what looks good on our false color, whatever way that we're finding it out. 2.8 is where we're going to set the lens, and that is what the key line is giving us for, I don't know, for a scene just like this, just an interview, whatever it might be. If we like that relationship, we leave it, right? That's our decision to then build out everything else. So this is the first step. It's like, let's get that right, and then let's start to distribute the values downstream. So the only options, if you can think of it like an option tree, it's like we set the base, and then it goes to the key relationship. And this can be, again, it can be -1, it can be -2, it can be 0. There's lots of different looks that you're going to cook in here. If you want the underexposed looks for the entire project, well, then it's probably not going to be at 0 that you want this, right? You're probably going to want it -1, -1.5, -2. And of course, the entire time I'm talking about all these things, it's much more nuanced in the sense that you're probably not going to be jumping in perfect stops. You might be doing a half stop. You might be talking with your gaffer or your team in thirds of stops. It's up to you. I generally like to keep it at half stops just because anything else than that starts to get very complicated. I like half stops. Again, small brain, not a lot of time. I will do halves, but this is really all you're setting. The box too. Key to the box. Do we like the overall mood? Do we want it slightly underexposed? Do we want it slightly overexposed? Because that's where we're going to have to maintain consistency over time. So you're measuring that as soon as you get the okay here, and sometimes it's the key if we're talking about studio lighting, and sometimes this will be to what we cannot control. So can't control, the double C. We're going to talk about that too in the next section. Studio, it's to the key. Location, it's to what you can't control. As soon as you set those levels, boom, we're into the distribution phase, and let's talk about that in the next section. So now if we know that the box is going to take priority at the beginning of a scene or a project or a setup or as you're making the lighting plan, and at the end, the distribution is going to take place in the middle. Now, this distribution, let me just walk through a flow chart of what we are expecting at the end of your studies, right? If it's not a giant, complete waste of time. At the end of your studies, you will have a flow chart of things that you'd like and things that you can easily identify just by looking at the 4 numbers, what the feel and the mood is going to be, right? So again, like the exposure tree, we're going to start off with key on this side, right? Then you're going to just distribute out to different looks. And this is going to be key and fill, right? That's going to be key and fill option number 1. And then you're going to have key and fill option number 2. And then you're going to have key and fill option number 3. Right? And you can imagine as this thing gets bigger and bigger and bigger, then you're going to have key 1, fill 1, and backlight 1. And then backlight 3, backlight 2, backlight 3. For each one of these things, it just is this chart that never ends. And it appears as though it's complicated, but it's not complicated at all. We know that, right? We know that generally, because of the exposure tree, these numbers here, these keys are going to be very specific, and they're going to be in a small area of confined space. And then the experimentation takes place everywhere else, right? The experimentation for the shading, which then creates the rounding effect, which is what creates the depth in the first place. That is where, like when we come into a project, the speed is, you're not actually, well, I think in this way. You might not actually think in this way. But if you could imagine what the decision-making process, as you're speaking with a director, as you're speaking with a lighting team, is what's happening. It's like, okay, we want character X. or scene X to be moody, right? Well, immediately I just go down this path to key at key and fill 3 stops under. And I know instantly what that's going to look like. In fact, this is that look, right? I could imagine once we get into the part where we're going to talk about using a light meter, which I think is next, we're going to measure this lighting, and you're going to see that this is key at key, and then this is fill at 3 stops under. That's it. Okay, well then what about the backlight? Do we play something harsh? That becomes, now you're starting to, I can immediately eliminate all this. I know, key at key and fill at fill, and fill at key. I know this is going to be a nonsense option, right? It's going to be flat, it's going to be terrible, we don't want that. This one, probably not enough. Key at key and fill at a stop under or 2 stops under, probably not going to be enough, right? Maybe if it's a lady and we're trying to make her look nice, maybe we go 2 under on something like that. But already I can start to see the face. And again, I think the advantage to do this is, which we're going to talk when we look at how to put this stuff into practice so that you get the easiest, quickest way to retain any of this information. I think in a shot exactly like this one, I think somebody's face looking at the camera, sort of, shoulders up. This is what this can fill in for any scene, no matter how wide you go. Right? It's all going to be based around people, or if it's just a subject, we're going to shape them the same way we shape a person. So with these 4 simple elements, you just streamline it. Okay, we don't have to worry about any of that. So now that I know it's going to be this scenario to get this look, I know how to do all those things at this distance. I know the tools that I'm going to need. I know what to look out for. I know I can practice again and again and again. If I get on set and I decide it's going to be, again, let's do it this way. Key to, let's imagine now this is key at key and fill at 3 under, and then we're going to have our distribution here. I know last time I did backlight 3 under as well. So backlight 3 under as well, fill at 3 under, key at 1, right? I know that worked, but maybe we go a little bit harsher this time. So now every single project that I do, I report back to my flowchart and I say, man, it looked good when we were doing the false color analysis of what the image might have been, but the colorist, maybe they took it too far, or maybe I did something wrong, I wasn't measuring the light enough, but this was, overcooking it and going backlight 4 stops under, you couldn't even see the backlight. Like it was way too little. So now I report that back to the system. So every time I do a job, I'm getting better. Every time I go out and I experiment with shooting the mannequin using the light meter, I'm getting better. And then, like I said, you never have to do that again. You never have to go through this process. I wonder what it would look like. Key at key, fill 3 stops under with a backlight of 4 under. I know that. And if I know that and no one else knows that, that gives me advantage over every other person because now I'm useful. Now I have some utility on set to be able to tell the team, hey, don't go 4 under on the backlight. Make sure it's 3 under. And don't get me out of my tent and interrupt my cappuccino time unless it's at 4 under or unless it's at 3 under, sorry. So that is why I would say this is the model that we're trying to be building up. And in the next section, let's talk light meter. Let's talk about false color. Let's talk about these tools, some of the pros and some of the cons. And then, of course, we're going to get into the actual implementation of the system to learn as fast as you can. Because ideally, we could just Neo you in the Matrix and just put it into your brain that again here, all of these steps, the final path for all of them, right? You just know this third chart, or really it's about 4 steps down, that you're gonna know all of these results. And if you know all these results, then you just cross out this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, and what remains? Key at a stop under, fill at 2 stops under, backlight at a stop over, and background at a stop and a half under. Done. Next. Like, okay, now that look is defined, then it's about how do we implement it? And that's where I'm saying we want to develop a skill like tying your shoes so you can then devote resources to problem solving of how we're actually going to do it, not worrying about what it's going to look like because we already know that. Again, that's mastering exposure. Going into this any longer, let's